Alright, so I missed my video last week, but I was sick, and in the time that I've been gone, I've actually upgraded my setup. Hopefully you can tell that the audio's a lot better, and that the, video quality, too, should be a lot better, a lot improved. A lot of people have been complaining about the video quality and audio quality in the past, so now hopefully I've got that fixed, and I can focus on just creating better videos for you guys and making more content about D&D and other stuff. I'll probably still use my handheld camera because it's pretty great. I'll show you what I was shooting on before. This is the camera that I was shooting on before. I just had it on a stand here, and I'll take some video right now of my new setup. It's definitely a lot better. It's not much more improved, but I managed to bust out some old cameras and buy a new mic stand, and yeah, so on to bigger and better things. For this week's video of experience gain, I wanted to talk about a topic that was actually requested by somebody who had watched one of my previous videos, and that was the Fey creatures and the Feywild. And it's a really big topic, so I think I'm actually going to split it into a few different videos. But for this video, I'm going to be focusing on the Feywild, how to make it an interesting aspect to your games, and how to actually run it evocatively back at your games at home. So I think the best place to start would be to talk about what the Feywild actually is. And simply put, I guess, the Feywild is one of the other planes of existence in the worlds of Dungeons & Dragons. That overlapping aspect is super interesting because if you actually take a look at the Dungeon Master's Guide or the Player's Handbook, it gives you some really creative and interesting examples, like the idea of a volcano in the material plane becoming some sort of crystalline structure, giant mountain in the Feywild, with fire burning inside at the center of these crystals. You can apply this to a lot of mundane features of the material plane to make them exotic and interesting and magical, more magical when they're transported into the Feywild. For example, a site of old ruins in the material plane might still be at the height of its existence in the Feywild. It might actually be a fantastic castle or a massive tower and not have fallen into these decrepit ruins. A long and beautiful river in the material plane might become a majestic source of otherworldly beauty in the Feywild. Every analog from the material plane to the Feywild becomes more extreme in whatever characteristics it holds in the Feywild, and it also becomes defined by nature and magic. And these three principles, the idea of nature being exacerbated in the Feywild, as well as magic becoming essential and integral to everything within the Feywild, and then lastly, this idea of things within the Feywild existing at extremes, are all the most essential parts of what makes the Feywild and what makes it different from the material plane. You can consider the material plane and think about it like our world. We exist at a wide range of spectrums and have a wide range of experiences and different kinds of environments. But in the Feywild, you're never going to have just a slightly sunny plain or a slightly sunny desert. Instead, if you do have a desert in the Feywild, it's going to be of scorching heat and endless sands and massive dunes. Or if you do have ruins in the Feywild, they're not just going to be simple dilapidated ruins. They're going to be extensive ruins, long overgrown, with many secrets within. They're going to be the most of what they can be. Whatever archetype that you're exemplifying in the Feywild, that the area or place exemplifies, is going to be intensified in the Feywild. A sinister bog is going to be maybe even almost demonic in nature, with spirits and phantoms lurking within the swamps. Visually, this makes the Feywild an extremely interesting place and allows you to get really creative with your descriptions. I think that every game master at some point in at least one of their games should take their party of players into the Feywild, just for the sheer innovativeness of what the players might encounter there. It'll be totally different than what's on the material plane, or at least it should be if you're taking the proper considerations of what the Feywild is like. One of my favorite visual aspects about the Feywild is the Persistent Twilight. It's always somewhere between dawn and dusk. The sun never fully sets or never fully rises. It always seems to be doing one or the other. This eternal twilight state of the Feywild actually has earned it the name the Twilight Kingdom. And so you have this entire plane of existence, this entire alternate world to whatever setting you're playing in, where everything is more magical, where nature is at its greatest, where everything in general that they might encounter, that the players might encounter, is at its most extreme. And most of all, they're in a place where stories have true meaning and power. This last point, the power of stories and the relationship between the Fey and the Feywild itself and stories, is key to understanding the Feywild and key to actually running compelling, evocative adventures in that setting. As a magical plane of existence, the Feywild has its own set of desires, and those desires are to bend everything and push everything towards becoming more like the key concepts of the Feywild. It wants to take anything that it encounters and make it more magical, or allow it to become more beholden to nature. It wants to push it to the extremes of whatever archetype or trope it plays into, and it wants to find a place to fit it into the story fiction, the story logic of the world. There's a lot I want to make sure to cover here, so I'll be referring to my notes from this point on. But the reason that this is so important to understanding the Feywild is, like any other character, once you know what the Feywild actually wants, you can start to then build up the encounters and adventures that your players might go on, and understand how the place, just like a villain in your story, might try to affect the characters that go through it and that encounter it. In this case, the characters are your adventuring party, and with the wants that we've established for the Feywild, if your party has a kind hero in it, the Feywild might want to turn that player's character into the valiant knight, and will give that character plentiful opportunities to act within that role, and will expect it to continue fulfilling that role once it's been confirmed, or once the player has shown that they do want to go in this direction. That same extent, a villainous person will be encouraged by the machinations of the Feywild and the Fey within it to become not just a simple villainous person, but the villain, an arch-villain, the most villainous thing and person they can possibly be. And if they respond to that path, that can have very dangerous portents for them and the rest of the party, or perhaps even the world itself. In a more insidious kind of way, a barbarian who's a little bit of a brute in your party might be encouraged by the Feywild to become completely brutish and clueless, and find their intellect actually shifting and diminishing over the course of the time that they spend in this area by virtue of the encounters that they're expected to join, and the way that the Fey creatures and the world itself actually responds to them. No Fey creature in the Feywild will be consulting the barbarian for their advice. Instead, they'll be trying to make the brutish barbarian become more of a brute, more savage, more crude. And they'll be treating that player's character as if they were already that extreme trope, because that's what the Feywild wants. It wants everything to fit into the story that it weaves at the most extremes of archetypes and tropes that all stories deal in. In my mind, this sort of insidiousness that's present in the Feywild is what makes it really compelling. If you just make it another strange plane of existence that's slightly more magical and where nature is emphasized, it'll be cool. But if you actually change the way the world's laws work, and you make the world itself have character, you're going to have a much more memorable experience playing through that with your adventuring group. The key then is to create adventures and situations where your players are pushed and pulled towards these roles to play, and the key for them is to either play into these tropes and roles or subvert it, right? Actually subvert the story that the Feywild is trying to weave by playing counter to the tropes and refusing to be put into these boxes, and navigating the wiles of the other creatures in the Feywild. The players, you're going to get to enjoy a sort of meta-narrative play where the players are actually encouraged to understand the stories that they're being forced into, that their characters are being forced into, and can use that meta-narrative knowledge of how stories are generally told to either play into the tropes of the damsel in distress, or the valiant knight, or the dastardly villain, or brutish barbarian, or completely subvert them and find themselves in a sort of meta-narrative war against the Feywild and its denizens. In the same way the Feywild attempts to shape beings who venture into its domain into these roles, beings that are natively from the Feywild will find themselves already fitting into these roles and acting the parts in the stories that the Feywild naturally weaves in its organic magic. It wouldn't be unusual for here, if anywhere, your players to encounter frolicking nymphs, or a maiden who's been asleep for 1,000 years who can only be awakened by true love's kiss. All those fables that we know as storytellers, as fans of stories, this is the place to put them. Allow your players to outwit the evil giant or go toe-to-toe with the dragon. In the Feywild, the impossible is probable because epic stories here are the rule. It's not realistic fiction. Instead, it's heroic fiction. And even if your base world, the material plane, is dark and gritty and particularly dangerous, the Feywild, instead, is dangerous in its own way, but actively encourages your players to do incredible things and rewards them for stepping into those roles. Whether you want to present this as a good thing, as an opportunity for your players to capitalize and achieve their potential, or as a bad thing, as a sort of entrapment where if they play their roles too fully, they can be locked in an endless cycle of stories in the Feywild. It's up to you, and honestly, maybe it's a bit of both. I think that's particularly interesting. Maybe the question is, how can your players get all the benefit of the Feywild and the potential and the growth of their skills that they can encounter there, while still remaining safe from the entrapment of that endless cycle of stories that they can fall into? After all, if your character becomes a dashing, valiant hero in the Feywild, do they really want to go back to the material plane where they have a much simpler existence? Maybe not. I think what would be even more interesting is that the longer your players and their characters spend in the Feywild, the more the rules kind of shift for them and they find the world changing, and the impossible becomes not simply probable, but entirely inevitable. It becomes likely. They realize that, yes, if I stay here, I can become the hero who saves the world. But the trap therein is that they might never leave the Feywild once they start following down that path. And instead, they have to contend with and accept that they're flawed people, flawed true beings that are not storybook characters, and then return to the material plane to contend with challenges that are difficult, where they're not guaranteed to win, where they might in fact fail and their fellow party members might die along the way. This gets us to part of what makes the Feywild so interesting and compelling to me, which is the kind of unlimited creativity that's available to you here. Because the Feywild pushes everything to the extremes, it pushes love, hope, paranoia, fear, anger to the extremes. That should be felt and seen in the creatures, the Fey and Sylvan creatures that actually occupy this plane that your characters might exist. And so take these principles, take these ideas, and think about what they might be like at their most extreme. Use the opportunity of playing in the Feywild, of playing in this fantastical plane of existence to come up with your own creative additions to your world. There's great resources out there already, certainly, but this is really an opportunity to make your game and your setting your own, even if in just small ways. Your version of the Forgotten Realms can be made entirely your own simply through the way you treat the Feywild and your thoughts on stories and these tropes. And you can fit that, you can make that an integral part of how you present the Feywild to your players and make the game much more personal in that way. If you need a guiding principle in your design, Mike Merles put it really well in a video with D&D Beyond that he did about the Feywild. He said that it's a realm guided by extremes, like we talked about, and here everything is going 100 miles an hour and crashing into each other. There's no simmering hatred in the Feywild, but instead there's blood feuds. There's no simple admiration. Instead, you have dramatic lover stories, right? You don't get a simple crush. You get Romeo and Juliet. And there's no disquieting fears. There's full-blown terror. Take everything to the extremes and throw your players for a loop with something really intense. There's no need for realism here. With all that in mind, you can start to think about the sentient beings that are native to the Feywild and how you want to present them. My favorite interpretation of the nature of the Fey beings who inhabit the Feywild is in taking them as almost prisoners to the archetypes and roles that they play. Because the Feywild is a storybook land, the people aren't really people. They're characters in the strongest sense of the word. And they have to play to the role that they embody. They've been here for many, many years, sometimes lifetimes compared to the player characters. And so they will fully embody whatever role the story is telling. The dastardly villain in the Feywild will always play the role of the very dastardly villain. And if you take this interpretation of the Fey to its logical extreme, then you make it so they have no free will. They're not ever changing like the short-lived mortals who change their mind from one day to another. Instead, they are unchanging and static. The queen will always be the queen of the Fae, and there are roles to play, and their roles will only change and shift when the story of the Feywild shifts. And so to plan a compelling Feywild adventure, I think you have to think about what is the story currently being told in the Feywild, and then know that your players, when they come into it, are probably going to throw a wrench into it, and then leave it up to them to adapt and take on the meta-narrative and see how are they going to shift the story. What new story are they going to put into action? And the Feywild will just be trying to keep up and catch up with them. Or if your players are a little too slow on the take, they're going to try to entrap your players in a story of their own telling. There's two different directions to go here. One is because the Fae are so static, they're going to love the idea of something new and different coming in the form of your players as travelers from another plane. The other direction is that, in fact, they enjoy the staticness, they enjoy the theater of playing their roles, and so they won't like the fact that new people are coming in to throw a wrench in. So they'll go out of their way, they'll go to extreme ends to try to bend and force your players into roles to fit the narrative that the Feywild is weaving. Of course, you can always take a third route, and maybe there are independents who seek to unmake the story being told in the Feywild, and will try to recruit your players to achieving their own ends. There's limitless options, and I'm not trying to draw false constraints. I'm just trying to give you a framework of how to think about the Feywild. I think that as long as your non-player characters and as long as your settings have their own designs and agenda that will be going on even while your players aren't there, that's really all you need to run an organic game. Past that, you don't need to structure it too much. You're obviously more than welcome to. I would never discourage you from writing your own Feywild full adventures, but this gives you the bare minimum that you need so that you can run a complex, compelling adventure without so much prep beforehand. So I've explained some of the different perspectives that Fey creatures might have on the nature of the Feywild itself, which might influence the NPCs that you actually create. Now what I want to talk about is the actual political structure of the Feywild and the Fey creatures there. There's many different approaches that you can take to this, and you don't have to go with this interpretation, but this is a pretty common one, and one that I think lends itself really well to the world and the interpretation of the Feywild that I've been putting forward in this video. That interpretation is that of the courts. You have two courts within the Feywild, the Summer Court and the Winter Court, and they're eternally at odds. However, there's sort of a yin-yang balance between the two of them. One can never truly defeat the other. Instead, they're always meant to be warring eternally with the knowledge that neither can win. But the deep rivalry between the two, or between the queens that lead the two, is what keeps that conflict rolling forever. And they play out story after story after story, at times the Winter Court winning, at times the Summer Court winning. I like to think about them as two rival theater companies that are both putting on a play, and they need the other group to put on the play with, but they really wish they didn't have to have them around. But the story wouldn't work without them. And however the story comes to a conclusion, once that's won, once the Summer Court has won that victory, then they move on to the next play, to the next story, and perhaps this time the Winter Court will win. And they go around and around and around in this way, in this static, unchanging manner that is core to the Fey beings of the Feywild. You might want to ascribe the mentalities that I mentioned, one group wanting to subvert the static nature of the Feywild, and another group really enjoying it and wanting to keep it, to each of these two courts, and then have the independent perspective be by independent Fey who don't participate in the courts, who are outside of this theater company and want to break free into their own rules or subvert them. I think I'll make another video in the future talking about those dynamics and the kind of politics of the Feywild and that sort of roleplay, if you think that's interesting. But for now, that's all I really want to say about that. I think by this point in the video, you should have a pretty good idea of the Feywild. You should understand the elements that drive it. You should understand what it really wants. You should know some of the political structure of how many of the Fey beings are organized, and some of the ways they might actually think about and feel about the place and the plane that they live in. And with all that in mind, you can probably shape, I hope you can shape, some interesting and compelling adventures for your players in this new and strange plane of existence that should be really fun for you. In a sort of lazy dungeon master style of approaching the Feywilds, there's a few key areas that I think will help you create really compelling adventures and experiences for your players in this plane of existence. The first are the Fey crossings, the places where the material plane and the Feywild actually connect, where your players can cross over into the Feywild. These areas are typically places where the area on each side closely reflects the other. So it wouldn't be an area where you have ruins in the material plane or a castle in the Feywild. It'd be somewhere where you have the same little grove of trees that exists both in the Feywild and both in the material plane. It's even possible that they're not persistently open. They might only open on a full moon, or if your crew, your party has the right item. In this way, some strange artifact that they find earlier on can perhaps be the key to letting them into the Feywild and completing a larger later quest. And of course, because these crossings are based off that similarity, they can be closed if one side is drastically affected. Or in the other way, they can even be opened by making both sides the same. And who knows what the repercussions of that might be. I think one thing to consider is the kinds of people that would be next to these crossings on both sides. In the Feywild side, you might have people who are interested in immediately knowing about travelers, right? Whether they want to rope them in or crush them, they're going to be paying attention to areas where strangers might come and disturb the balance, whether they want that or not. And on the material plane side, you'll probably have people drawn to stories, drawn to fables and myths. I always like the idea of bards living near the crossings. These bards can give your characters a primer on what they might expect in the Feywild. This idea that the reality there is made by stories, and that to survive, your characters won't be able to win through force of arms. Instead, they need to understand the narrative and understand their place in the story, and either play into it or subvert it. This might mean drawing Excalibur from its stone, or slaying the dragon, or rescuing the damsel, or saving the prince from being murdered by his elder brother. I don't know. I'm sure you can come up with something that you find compelling that you think your group would enjoy. So Fey crossings are one piece of it. Then there's the idea of, in the Feywild, in playing into or subverting the story, the idea of contracts, of agreements with the Fey. They're notoriously tricky creatures, and a big part of that is that they're playing by rules that the mortal world doesn't operate by. And I've always enjoyed the concept of the sort of devil's contract that the Fey and devils alike are somewhat known for, which is that if you agree to a contract, if you make a deal, if in this case you agree to play into the story that the Feywild is weaving, then you better not break it, because the Feywild is a plane of magic, and strange things can happen. If a brave warrior promises to fight the scary beast, but then breaks their promise and doesn't show up on the fated date of the duel, or leaves the Feywild before they complete the story, then they might find themselves turned into a frightened little creature destined to spend an eternity running away from everything. They were meant to be courageous, but in breaking their pact, they are now doomed to be cowardly. Again, it's an extreme thing, but there's nothing saying that your players can't reverse this or break it or complete the story to undo the curse on one of their fellow members. This could be super interesting. You can have really real strange consequences in this way that your players will always remember. If you want to use the Fae as tricksters in this way, and you want to take it to its logical extreme, I think it's really fun to give them constraints, give them rules to play by. It's very challenging to do as a dungeon master, but it can have a really great effect on your games and your players. Here are the rules that I've seen most commonly associated with the Fae by looking online and different portrayals of them in fiction, and that I really enjoy. 3 laws of the Fae. First, harm no outsiders. Unless, of course, you're slighted first or challenged to a duel or it's part of the narrative. Otherwise, they will harm no one. They will seek to keep the story going unless it's made official or really justified. 2, break no oaths. It fits into this contractual idea. A deal made is absolute and should never be broken. And by the same token, the Fae will never seek They'll always try to worm their way out with clever wording to not be fully bound to a deal. And this fits really well in with the third piece, which is speak no false words. Speak no false words is don't knowingly tell a lie. But the Fae are going to be tricky, right? They might not say the full truth, even if they're not lying. And the best way to get them to actually say the closest thing to the truth that they might say is to ask the questions 3 times in succession, and so that every time they give you a slightly different, vague version of the not truth, and so you can kind of triangulate what they actually mean. I know this sounds complicated, but take these 3 rules and interpret them in your own way. Harm no outsiders, break no oaths, speak no false words. Your players might not know these rules. They might only learn them after adventuring in the Feywild or making an ally. But these are the rules that your Fae are going to act with in mind. And that's going to be really cool because that's going to make it real. That's going to make the aspect of the Fae beings playing a different game than your player characters are completely real. And when your players figure it out, they're going to be able to look back on the encounters that they've had with those Fae beings and say, oh, right, they're bound by this, and these are the tools you're going to be able to use to unwind the narrative. If you're going to give them challenges that aren't combat-based, you need to give them weapons that aren't combat-based to use against the enemies. And in this case, knowledge of these rules, forcing Fae into deals that they can't break, or knowing that they won't harm you unless slighted first or it's part of the story, or knowing that they'll never speak any falsehoods, even if they never give the full truth. These are great weapons for your players to wield if they're creative role players able to put those into use. So, Fae crossings, the contracts with the Fae, and that sort of dastardly trickery element to them. And then, of course, the idea of Fae vulnerabilities. What are they weak to? We've talked about stories and how essential and integral that is to them. Perhaps subverting a story might be something really dangerous for them. But there's another direction to that I think is interesting, which is the idea that the Feywild, as much as it's a plane of magic, it's also a plane of nature. And so industrial things like iron, for example, or a pistol, if you use those in your settings, if you have those in your games, might be something strange and foreign to the Feywild that offers some sort of shielding protection from the magics that might influence your players' minds or might actually be very useful in hurting Fae creatures if your players decide to fight them head on. It makes a lot of sense to me that a druid's nature magic, someone who might be extremely powerful in the material plane, is in fact weaker and weakened in the Feywild, not because their abilities are affected, but because their abilities are less effective on the creatures and beasts they might encounter in this plane that is flooded with nature magic. Whereas someone who uses industrial tools and weapons, who are the complete contrary counterpoint to everything the Feywild is, will be more effective there because they're bringing in something strange and foreign that doesn't fit into the pattern of stories being weaved there. And so it'll be easier for them to break through, to hurt the players and change the story with those implements. Perhaps a bard at the Fey Crossing can tell your players to carry some iron on them or some nicely forged steel, give them some clockwork contraptions that they know to be protective charms that are purely scientific in application. They have no magic, but in the Feywild, that's what makes them special. And finally, we've talked about going into the Feywild, we've talked about being there, encountering Fae, the weaknesses that they might have. Now we've got to talk about leaving the Feywild. The Dungeon Master's Guide has a section on this too, with 2 key elements that they focus on, which I'll reiterate because I think these are plenty. The first is memory loss. Memory loss is the idea that your characters, upon exiting the Feywild, might lose all memory of what they've done there. The DC 10 wisdom throw that the book suggests is pretty low, so it's not a high likelihood that they'll forget. But if they do fail, it's a great little change, and it adds to the magic of the Feywild, one final wave goodbye as your players leave this strange realm. Characters are made immune by Fey ancestry. That connection to the Feywild in their blood makes it so they don't have to make this check. But even if they succeed, their memories of the Feywild are hazy, this strange storybook land. It's like your memories of playing Dungeons & Dragons. It's not quite you, but it felt real and it feels real. It's just slightly different from the material world that we occupy. And in fact, this memory loss is considered a curse by the rules of the book, so it can always be cleansed by tools or magic that remove curses. The second element of Fey magic upon leaving the Feywild is time warp, which is that while you're in the Feywild, time seems to pass normally. You can notice no discernible difference. But upon exiting, because of the Feywild's magic, you can either have spent a lot more time there than you thought, or a lot less. There's, on page 50 of the DM's Guild, there's a whole table that you can roll on or choose from to decide whether the hours they spent there or the weeks they spent there were actually just seconds in the real world, or in the other way, the hours they spent there were weeks and months in the material world. Both are really interesting in their own way, and I just suggest you pick whatever is most dramatic. This is a really cool way of giving your players a time skip where if they've saved a village and are now venturing into the Feywild, upon exiting 2-3 years could have passed and they can see how the village has progressed, and villains that they could have chased down have had a chance to grow stronger and amass their forces, or allies have been put into precarious positions and now they must come back. Or only a few seconds have passed, but they've become far stronger, and so they get a power boost to face a dastardly foe that they before didn't have the strength to face, but now with the time change of the Feywild, which is uncontrollable, they're able to rally their forces and have the force of arms to face these threats. Alright, so that was a lot. That was my whole brain dump on the Feywild. I hope you found it interesting and useful, and that it gave you some ideas for running Feywild encounters and adventures in your own game. I think I'd like to make other videos about the Feywild, about Fey creatures, or the Wild Hunt, or maybe even the Shadowfell as a different topic, and how you can make all those evocative in your games, because I find them all really interesting, especially the Wild Hunt. I think it's a really cool element that I rarely see integrated into adventures. That I really like. So hopefully you liked it. Let me know if you do want to see any of those videos or any other ideas that you have. Comment below. I read everything. Yeah, if you don't know what the series is, this is Experience Gain. I'm Jeremy Malul. I make these videos every Friday, either about D&D or about other creative topics. I did miss last week because I was sick, but otherwise I've been on a pretty good streak, so I hope you will subscribe if you like this video and follow along, because I'm going to keep making more, and I'm looking forward to just continuing to nerd on about Dungeons & Dragons with you. Alright, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next week.